Welcome back, everybody. In this lecture, we're going to be exploring a very popular topic in what we often call group processes. When exploring this topic, we're going to be doing something somewhat unique. We're not only going to be looking at how groups impact individuals, but we're also going to be, as we're exploring this topic, looking at how groups themselves can impact groups, something that's sort of unique to this topic. But before we get into all those really critical details, it's probably first important to just define some things. So, what is it that we can look at when talking about groups? We can look at research trying to understand why groups are formed, maybe some of the pluses and minuses that come from getting into groups. But we can also spend a lot of time talking about how the individual themselves is pulled in different directions. But to understand all of these impacts, we need to understand some basic definitions that all researchers studying groups use. So without further ado, let's just define what a group is. Well, when we look at groups as researchers in social psychology, what we tend to argue is that group should be defined as a collection of three or more individuals who interact with each other, require each other's participation, and have usually some type of goal in mind. Now, some of you, when you saw that number three, might have immediately thought, well, what happens if just two people get together? Are they not called a group? Well, they sort of are. They're what we call a dyad. But if we're looking at the heart of group research, most people tend to focus on groups of three or more, recognizing that there's a lot of interesting dynamics that start to get introduced when you get beyond that dyad side. And one of the things that starts to become much more prominent as groups get larger are these things that we call group norms, that kind of standards that are either implicit or explicit that start to be placed on members of the group or kind of the group as a whole. These group norms vary dramatically from group to group, but what we tend to see in numerous group studies is that group norms tend to be one of the first things that start to emerge as groups start to solidify and really establish what their goals are. And this brings us to another really interesting thing that starts to emerge as groups get larger and larger, and it's these things called social roles. These kind of shared expectations that are placed on individual members within a group that relates to that individual member's specific contribution to the group. Now, some members of a group might have multiple social roles, but what we tend to see is that as groups form, usually people get designated for very specific purposes. Now, most of us could probably think of things like presidents and treasurers and, I don't know, managers. Those are very specifically set out social roles that individuals are playing within the groups that they're a part of. But there's also more implicit based social roles that might emerge as well. There might be somebody that always leads the conversations or always questions certain plans or feels compelled to always make sure that everybody's feeling happy. In most research on groups, what we see is that there's kind of a combination of both explicit and implicit norms and roles that are always being navigated with as groups start to form and as groups start to accomplish whatever it is that they've come together to accomplish. I mean, mind you, sometimes the goals do become a little bit more obscure over time, but usually when we look at the formation of groups, there is some type of need involved. And this is also something that separates out groups from people that just get together because. Right? Many people, when they think of the groups they're a part of, tend to focus on things like family members or maybe their group of friends. Even though those things could potentially be defined as groups, it's really important to note that most research on groups doesn't focus on those kind of inherent things that seem to be persistent even if goals aren't in mind. And that's because a lot of the focus on groups is what they can achieve And, well, it's tough to really calculate out what a family or a group of friends is coming together to achieve. Let's look at this a little bit closer. So when I talk about all these specifications about what's required to get into groups and what groups are designed to do, you might start to ask, well, what is the value of groups in the first place? Right? Is it just about trying to achieve goals, or is there more inherent things that people have looked at when trying to understand the importance of groups? Especially when we ask people to, say, list how many groups they're a part of, and they start to intuitively tie that to kind of a measure of value. Well, when we look at what really draws people to groups, what compels them to be in them, we see that there's kind of a multitude of benefits of being in a group. Evolutionary psychologists, people we've referenced a few times, have contended that maybe us being drawn to groups is just this innate thing. There's theoretically safety in numbers. There's much greater chance of accomplishing what we're trying to accomplish when we come together with others. So maybe we're, again, as we usually see with evolutionary ideas, the offspring of great ancestors who essentially were compelled to work with others while their other family members or people that did not have genes to kind of be compelled to go into groups didn't survive. And we are really just forced biologically, according to this theory, to have this innate need to be in groups, even if it's not necessarily something that's going to help us survive in a moment. There's also, though, when we're looking at being drawn to groups, lots of other more subtle yet important things that could potentially draw all of us to groups, even if maybe we don't see ourselves as very outgoing, or what we sometimes call in personality psychology, extroverted. One thing that could be important to many people when it comes to being drawn to groups is that oftentimes when we think of group membership, we think of it being an indicator of some type of social desirability. Right? When you describe somebody as a loner, you sometimes implicitly imply that they are somehow socially undesirable because they don't appreciate the company of others. That's maybe not an accurate assumption, but because it's an inherent thing, it's something that's discussed kind of implicitly in lots of different circles, that assumption might be one of the big catalysts to compel people to get into groups, be those assumptions true or not. But if we're looking for another thing that could intuitively impact people's desires to be in groups, relates to something that we talked about earlier, and it's this concept of the self. We talked earlier about how many times when people are asked to assess who they are, they look at their behaviors. They look at some of the things that they can articulate about themselves. Well, one great way to get a better sense of who you are is just to look at what things you're a part of. And once you've identified those things you're a part of, well, then you have a clearer sense of the self. And that can be very comforting to a large number of individuals. So what I want you to get from this little conversation here is that even if maybe we did have some preordained genetic predisposition to be drawn to groups and to want to kind of increase our chances of surviving by being with others, there's also lots of other more subtle and oftentimes verifiable reasons for why groups are so unbelievably popular, which then might lead you to ask, well, if they're popular, are they doing what we're hoping they're supposed to accomplish? Well, when we talk about what groups are supposed to accomplish, obviously the main thing we focus on with groups is, are they achieving the task that they've come together to achieve? But it's important to note that in addition to just basic questions about whether or not a group is achieving a task, there's other elements to getting into a group that are considered valuable. And one of the things that's very helpful is not just accomplishing a task, but being able to accomplish the task much more quickly. This relates to an idea of what we call efficiency. And numerous studies have shown that more often than not, when people get together with others, they tend to accomplish their goals much faster than they could on their own. Now, we're going to talk a little bit later about whether or not groups are truly as efficient as they could be, something that's actually contradicted by a lot of research. But when we just compare a group's performance versus individual performances, what we do tend to see is that lots of people coming together tend to accomplish something much faster than just individuals working on their own on a specific task. What really enhances this effect are some of the things that we talked about earlier. Having clear social roles and group norms can make groups all the more efficient. Again, we'll look at this idea of whether or not groups are as efficient as they could be, and whether or not the added effects of everybody coming together really pan out. But as a whole, more often than not, we see getting into a group a way of getting whatever our goal is accomplished much faster than if we tried to do it alone. Another thing that's really interesting when it comes to groups is that as people get into groups, as they form and start to develop those social rules and norms, another thing called group cohesiveness starts to pick up, where people not only feel like they can accomplish a specific task, but they feel that they've grown closer to each other, that they've somehow maybe grown friendships or some type of camaraderie with the individuals that they've gotten into a group for. And this can be sort of perceived as sort of a side benefit of getting in a group. More often than not, when we say get into study groups, trying to get together to understand material within a class, we're doing it because we do want to learn that material, but we appreciate the fact that once we're in that group, we tend to make a few friends. We tend to find people that we can commiserate with, and maybe find individuals that we can hang out with even after that group, once the class has ended, has dissolved. And this idea of group cohesiveness cannot be overlooked when we're looking at the benefits of the group. Yes, it's often about accomplishing the original goal that the group came together for, but sometimes this added benefit of feeling closer to others or feeling this high likelihood of getting together again with these others for other tasks is a big draw and something that leads a lot of individuals to be compelled to get into groups and expect other benefits out of being in a group beyond just trying to accomplish those tasks. And this might lead you to think that groups and being a member of a group is always wonderful without any costs. But as you probably are also surmising, just based on the image that you're looking at here, we do in lots of group research focus also on not only the benefits of getting into a group, but the costs, the things that are not desirable and that we have to be mindful of when we do become a member of a group. When looking at kind of how individuals get impacted in negative ways when they get into a group, one of the terms that's often mentioned is this idea of something called de-individualization, where people no longer feel like they're a unique individual, but instead feel more like a part of a whole or a cog within a machine. There's lots of research that's shown that when people behave within a group, they feel significantly less responsible for their actions. And they feel actually more inclined to go with individuals making suggestions than if they were just a collection of individuals that weren't considered a part of the group. And if you increase those norms and those roles, again, you increase the de-individualization within people, and you can tend to get people to bend to authority figures or group plans much more in those situations. There's also other kind of odd social factors that have been shown to increase de-individualization even more. One of them is actually shown here in this image, where everybody, as you see here, is dressed in the exact same way. It might seem weird to think that putting on an outfit that's identical to somebody else could dramatically impact your behavior, but numerous studies have shown that individuals like football players or members of societies where they wear these hooded outfits and other things tend to instantly report feeling much more de-individualized as a result of getting into those outfits, and tend to behave in ways that kind of act more in accordance with the group than as disparate individuals, as they not only, I guess, feel more de-individualized, but they look more de-individualized by some of the factors that are kind of they're forced into, I would say. Now, I'm guessing many of you are sitting there thinking right now, okay, we know that being in a group comes at a cost to the individual, but we've already talked about how being in a group can help the group become more efficient and also help the members of the group feel a closer bond to each other, thus probably ensuring that the group might get together in future circumstances when there's a new goal to be accomplished. So it might, if you're looking at a balancing in the ledger, seem to suggest that being in a group is always good to the group and maybe not always great to the individual. Now that's only part of the story. If we talk about what happens to the group as a whole when people get into a group, there are definitely pluses to that group membership. But one of the things that we often see when tabulating how a group could potentially perform in an ideal situation is that there's oftentimes an effect that we call process loss that occurs when a group forms. And this process loss suggests that not only is the group less efficient than it should be overall, but it's not necessarily always getting to responses that are as beneficial as could have possibly been obtained if the members of the group were working individually. This might seem contradictory to what we talked about earlier, but understand that when we talked about groups getting together to be more efficient, most of the focus earlier was on just how, when compared to single individual efforts, people coming together get stuff done much faster. But if we look at what we would expect to find when adding up the aggregate amount of efficiency from each individual contributing, what we see is there seems to be sort of some energy lost, where you would expect that the group would actually be faster than they're performing in most situations, and also the group would come to solutions to problems in much better ways than what you're looking at in terms of the kind of end product of those groups. And this process loss, we believe, is not only very common, but it's kind of a byproduct of some very specific things. One of the things that is very common when people get into groups, especially when norms and some of the social rules are established, is this thing that we call groupthink, where while group members are focusing on the specific goal at hand, they also have a tendency to really focus on trying to sort of create a unified front. The name kind of hints at what it's all about. Right? We think about the group and trying to make sure that nobody's acting independently and everybody's kind of going in step with everybody else. And in doing so, we might create that extra form of kind of solidarity with group members. But again, it sort of comes at a cost, because sometimes that creativity and independence, that flexibility that we have on our own, can allow us to course correct when we find we've gone astray. This groupthink can really be enhanced through situations where groups come together and there's dominant figures that are really steering the group in a specific direction, and there's maybe ineffective ways of checking those dominant figures, or even checking the path that the group has decided to go down. Obviously, you have a dominant figure that's not necessarily making choices that are problematic. It might not be a big deal, but oftentimes what we see when somebody is the de facto leader without there being any vetting as to why they would be the leader is that those leaders don't necessarily make any decisions better than any one individual alone. So a lot of those extra resources and those ideas that could be utilized just aren't utilized in the groups like we would expect. Another odd thing is that even if there isn't necessarily a leader, There does seem to be substantial research to suggest that we all innately, when we get into groups, tend to try to focus our attention on the things that we all know. And when we do that, we sort of neglect the fact that our unique information, our unique knowledge, might be the most valuable thing when we get together in a group. There was this really interesting study done back in 1985 where students were brought in and given information about multiple candidates that they could potentially vote for in an election. And what the two researchers, Stasser and Titus, did in this study was configure the information in a way so that when people were on their own and given information about one particular candidate, that candidate always seemed significantly more desirable than the other one. But when people were brought into groups, the idea was that everybody would have kind of one unique bit of information that was not necessarily great for one person, and then a lot of shared information that was positive for that person. If you're adding it up, would suggest that, because everybody only had a few limited positive things about this person and a vast array of negative things, if everybody was contributing their own bit of information, that one candidate should be seen as significantly less desirable. But that's not what they found in their work. What they tended to find was that people actually kind of put extra emphasis and weight on that shared information. Not only kind of neglecting that unique stuff that was out there, but almost overvaluing that information that was shared, assuming that that meant that it had extra potency. And when we look at the end product of this, what we typically see with process loss is just groups aren't nearly as effective as we'd hope, and they tend to maybe make decisions that, well, they maybe regret later on, or could do better on if there was ways to kind of minimize this groupthink or minimize the impacts of dominant figures or kind of ineffective communication channels. But there are, if we're looking at the history of this, some pretty robust examples of how process loss can be extremely detrimental. The classic example that's often cited in textbooks and in movies is a tragedy that occurred a number of decades ago that we nowadays just call the Challenger example. But that's kind of minimizing the tragedy and sadness tied to this. And to understand what this was all about, provide some context, because I'm guessing some of you have not experienced this historical moment in our history, I thought I'd put up a video that details the events of the Challenger explosion and also goes into some of the things that led up to the event and sort of an assessment of how all of the different elements at NASA that really promoted things like groupthink could have led to this disaster that was, again, just a result of process loss, even though a much more tragic one than we typically think of when looking at, say, study groups getting together or other things. So I encourage you at this point to pause and go watch that video. And when you come back, we'll explore some other things that are going on when it comes to how groups impact us and other nuances to what we might run into if we try to challenge the group. I'm hoping many of you got a chance to see that video. And after seeing it, I'm guessing many of you were compelled to think about how you yourself might have been able to avert that specific crisis and how some of the factors of process loss might have been minimized through just a few people dissenting from that situation that arose. Well, if you're wondering about those things, understand that this is not necessarily something that social psychologists haven't been thinking of for decades. In fact, numerous studies have looked at the stress and toll that's taken on individuals that do realize a group might not be going in the right direction and try to either steer it correctly or get out of the group. One of the first studies that looked at this is considered by many social psychologists as a classic. In fact, it was one that was replicated into a movie. Well, a version of this story was replicated into a movie a number of years later. It was a famous study done by a social psychologist named Schachter, who ran this experiment that we later called the Johnny Rocco case. It was called this because there was this hypothetical court case that people were asked to be a participant in that involved this person named Johnny Rocco, who had committed what seemed like a very obvious violent crime. Participants in this study were all invited in, told they were going to be jurors for this hypothetical case, and told that they were going to just be part of this pilot study looking at how jurors interacted with each other and how they came to some of the conclusions that they came to. And the beginning of this experiment was fairly uneventful. People acted like it was a typical court case. There was an abundance of evidence against this individual named Johnny Rocco. And the jurors, much like we have in our court systems, after they had heard everything, were invited to go back into deliberation and talk about their verdict, needing a not just majority, but a consensus on whether or not this individual named Johnny Rocco was guilty or innocent of the crime that he was accused of committing. Now, mind you, again, it seemed very abundantly clear, and this is what Schachter had designed the study to be, that Johnny Rocco had committed the crime that he was on trial for. And 11 of the people participating in this 12-person jury were actual participants. But there was one Confederate within each of the different iterations of the study, a 12th person who was a Confederate and told under no circumstances should they go with the group. So when the group started to vote, and as predicted, almost unanimously, or usually 100% unanimously, came to a conclusion that Johnny Rocco had committed the crime, this one Confederate then was told to, again, stand against the rest of the group. And what Schachter wanted to see was how the group would react to this individual, this Confederate that they didn't know was actually a Confederate, they just thought was another participant, when they were not going along with the group. Now, mind you, there were other factors at play here that maybe aren't always a critical component to people breaking with the group. Right? The group was not allowed to disband until everybody went with each other. There seemed to be a lot of obvious characteristics to kind of the fact that this person not going with the group was doing something undesirable. But we still like to cite Schachter's research because of how, say violently, but strongly, the participants in this study reacted to this person that was not going along with the group. Oftentimes, Schachter reported people yelling at this participant or this Confederate that was not going along with the group. As it dragged on and things were brought up like who needs to clean things or who needs to pick up stuff or pay for things, this person that was persisting and not going with the group was assigned a lot of these poor tasks. There were numerous groups that tried to lobby to the researchers to just have this one person removed from the experiment because they thought they weren't being reasonable. And at other times, this person was just sort of treated as an outsider, where the group continued to try to figure out a way to get this person to budge without actually talking to the person, almost pretending that they weren't there, something that we often call ostracism. And what Schachter concluded from this study was that if a group feels that somebody's not necessarily behaving in accordance with the group or potentially trying to break the group, these groups get pretty harsh pretty fast for these people. And this on its own might compel many individuals who have reservations about what the group is doing to sort of just keep their mouth shut and go along with what the group is planning, because there's this implicit recognition that the backlash or some of the consequences of not going with the group are pretty harsh. In fact, I want to focus a little bit more on the last one that we listed here. So even though Schachter's research on the repercussions of somebody not going with the group mentioned ostracism, it wasn't necessarily something that his research really focused on. It was just kind of this side thing that he identified. This concept of ostracism, though, piqued the interest a couple decades later of a researcher down at Purdue named Kipling D. Williams, who, through one of his own experiences at a park where two individuals were playing frisbee, he was invited to play for a little while, and then eventually he sort of got left out, led Williams to explore ostracism much more than Schachter or any other researchers had before. And to study this concept of ostracism, he invented this very unique and interesting type of experiment that he called cyberball, where people would come in, sit at a computer, be told that there were two other individuals participating in a study, looking at computer screens that were identical to them, and all they would be doing in this activity is essentially playing catch with everybody around them. Now, they were telling these people that they would be measuring things like who they responded to, how quickly they responded, whether or not they were behaving consistently throughout. But at the heart of Williams' true experiment was the fact that when these people would start out in this cyberball activity, everything would be fairly normal. They'd have about 1 in 2 chance of having the ball thrown to them every time somebody had it. And it would just kind of progress for a minute or two, as most of us would predict. People were kind of bored, just clicking on things randomly, wondering what the heck the experiment was about. But as the study started to progress, they started to be what Williams defined as ostracized, where the other two individuals that they saw on the screen started to throw the ball back and forth to each other, in the beginning only rarely throwing it to the true participant, and eventually, as it progressed, never throwing the ball to the true participant. And these two people just continued to throw the ball back and forth to each other while the participant looked on. Now, Williams sort of just, again, mimicked this off of his own experience, wondering how people would react. And what he found was very surprising. More often than not, when people started to be ostracized, they sort of saw it as a funny joke or something weird going on. But very quickly, they started to transition into very strong negative emotions. Some displayed really strong signs of anger. Others immediately got depressed and sad. Others got very confused and started trying to figure out what they'd done wrong or what was causing this anomaly in their experiment. But all of these individuals displayed great concern over what was happening on the screen in front of them. He even reported some individuals got up out of their seats, running around the building trying to find the other participants that were no longer allowing them to participate in the experiment. And this really spurred on a lot of other subsequent research on the impacts that ostracism could have on us. Many of these studies were done by Williams and some of Williams' students over the years. And what they were able to show was that the immediate impacts of ostracism are very robust. They can be a way to curb behavior very quickly. But if people encounter ostracism on a regular basis, it goes beyond just the situation. What it eventually can do is have an impact on both mental and physical health. Numerous studies that Williams and his colleagues have ran, when just surveying individuals reporting mental health and physical health issues, discuss feeling ostracized on a regular basis. Now, there is an admittance that sometimes there is circular relationship issues that are tough to tease apart, but nonetheless, the evidence seems to be pretty conclusive that ostracism in that Johnny Rocco case that was run by Schachter, even though it was seen as just kind of a side thing, might have actually been one of the most prominent tools and powerful tools the participants were using to try to curb the behavior of these individuals, because we have a very implicit understanding of how impactful pretending somebody's not there can be to a person. Now, I'm worried you might assume after the path that we've started to go down that I'm trying to tell you that being in a group is always a horrible thing and it's really important to get out, but just be warned that if you try to get out, you're not necessarily going to have a very good experience. That's not what I'm trying to get at here. What I'm trying to show you is that these dynamics of being in a group are very complex. And this also can relate to not just how we feel about the group, but how we ourselves are performing in the group and contributing to the group. Another pair of topics that are talked a lot about when looking at group dynamics in things like industrial organizational psychology or even things like economics, these concepts of something called social facilitation and social loafing. Essentially, what people studying these two topics focus on is how being around others and how having them being able to monitor or not monitor our performance impacts the total output that we create when we are tasked in a group to accomplish some goal. What we see with social facilitation is that sometimes, more often, well, sometimes in social situations, individuals, when they're a part of a group, are being monitored. Their behaviors, their productivity can be quantified in some way, and everybody's made aware of what it is they're doing. In other situations, when people are part of a group, their behaviors are not really quantifiable, or they're not being directly monitored. In that case, we're looking at situations that involve what we call social loafing. The names sort of suggest that when we are being monitored, we're probably going to produce more or do better. At least that's what the word facilitation typically means. But that's only true some of the time. So what people studying social facilitation have discovered is that when the group is monitoring us and we're doing a relatively easy task or one that's not necessarily extremely challenging, what we tend to see is that facilitation, and the people paying attention to us, puts us on more cognitive high alert. Sometimes this is linked to a concept that you see listed here on the slide called arousal, and that tends to get us to do a little bit more than maybe we would do if we were on our own, or if maybe nobody was looking at us. But, and this is a big exception, what we also see is that if the group is monitoring us and we're doing a really difficult, challenging task, that added arousal or cognitive energy can sometimes result in us not being as productive as if we were kind of in a more calm state of mind. And this, again, sort of flies in the face of the term social facilitation. Again, it screams that maybe we should be better every time when people are looking at us, but it's only in those situations where things are doable. When they're challenging, having others stare at us is not necessarily something that can often enhance us. I'm guessing many of you can recall personal experiences where this has occurred. The name social facilitation, the name social loafing, the other side of the coin, also is probably a misnomer, because it sort of suggests that when people aren't looking at us, that we're always going to kind of minimize our effort. Well, that is true in the relatively easy, benign tasks, but when we're doing something challenging, not being monitored is theoretically something that can be helpful. It can allow for more creative thoughts. It can allow for us to change course if we've decided something isn't going the way we'd like. And there have been studies to show that when people are given a chance to sort of work on their own and not be monitored and then come back together, not having that person looking over your shoulder can be, in some cases, a very productive thing. And all of this highlights this kind of complex story that we keep getting into when we talk about being a part of a group. There's pluses to groups, there's negatives to groups, and all of these things not only involve the group, but the individuals within it. These two terms are just extra things to get thrown on that pile of complexity. What else can we see when we see members of a group get together? Well, one thing that happens not necessarily every time when a group gets together, but when a group gets together with a like mindset, is a process that we call group polarization. Let's say you get together with classmates and decide to study for a class, and you find that all of you are coming from different angles in terms of how much you like the instructor, or how much you like the material, or how motivated you are to learn. Well, if there are all of those differences, take comfort in the fact that you probably won't experience group polarization. But I'm also guessing many of you can recall times when you've gotten together with groups that were of a like mindset. Maybe you've had a group that you knew of that was very interested, as you can see in this picture, in doing stuff like partying for spring break or going somewhere and just enjoying yourself. And when those individuals got together, or when you were part of that group and got together with these individuals, my guess is that there was a high potential for this thing called group polarization to occur. Where if we looked at everybody's original opinions on something or everybody's goals on something, what we'd find is that once those individuals got together, the group as a whole probably went more extreme than anybody would have guessed just by looking at people's individual opinions. If we're looking at this example, one might surmise that most of these individuals probably had the intention of having a good time and going a little crazy, but maybe they didn't intend to get quite as overboard as they likely are going to get in this scenario when everybody started coming together. You might ask, well, is there much research behind this, or do we just know this is the case? Well, what we see in numerous types of studies is that group polarization is not only something that we can describe in examples, but we see lots of situations where it's extremely prominent and problematic. We tend to find investment firm studies and business, I guess, how am I going to describe this? Business ventures that go wrong, and even people who cheer for sports teams that get into fights. That what occurs oftentimes with group polarization is that people tend to get to a point where even if they're in support of something, they become remorseful as to how far they go in those movements towards those things that they thought were originally good ideas and assumed everybody else was on the same page. And it might lead you to say, well, if we know that people go overboard when they're with people like them, or when businesses or investment firms know that groups go overboard, especially ones that recognize there's financial implications around it, why can't we just reel it back? Why can't we just kind of prohibit it from happening? Now, the reason for this is multifaceted. What we tend to see when groups get together is that everybody's sort of coming in with lots of cognitions and ideas that make it very tough to overcome group polarization. More often than not, we already, and this is kind of a required component to group polarization, come into a situation with a specific mindset, but maybe some questions about how justified or righteous or whatever we want to call it our mindset is. But when we find ourselves paired with a large number of people that have that same mindset, we might do away with some of those concerns or the lack of confidence we have in those opinions or goals. And this can be problematic because oftentimes those concerns, those uncertainties, can be one of the things that maybe aren't enticing us to go to some type of extreme relating to what it is we're thinking about. There's also this belief that starts to grow as we find more and more people in our group are all on the same page that well, maybe everybody is of this mindset. And this could potentially lead to situations where there might be even members of the group or just definitely members of the population that aren't in alignment. We start to forget that, neglect that once we find ourselves surrounded by people that look or seem like they're like-minded with us. And what can exacerbate this is that when we look at discussions, what we see is what we talked about with the process loss idea, that when people get together in groups, they have a tendency to focus their attention on agreed upon information. So if you know you're paired up with a bunch of people that came together for a similar idea, the conversation tends to revolve around that similar idea, and the more and more you discuss it, the more and more that idea seems good, and the more difficult it is to take a step back and reassess. In the end, group polarization often results in maybe some regrettable decisions, hopefully nothing that's catastrophic, but again, we see in these examples another wrinkle when it comes to getting into groups. They're not necessarily bad, but the components to being in a group can have lots of impacts on the individual and the group. What I'd like to do in the final half of this class is explore one last big thing that groups can do to the individuals. And this effect relates to something we talked about at the very beginning of this lecture. You remember back to our just basic definition of groups. We talked about what groups were. We talked about these things called group norms. And then we talked about these things called social roles. I mentioned that these are really critical components within groups, especially as our groups start to solidify. And these things can be very impactful in terms of how effective the group is and whether or not the group can get things done quickly. Now, these social roles do have their values, but when we get into groups, what we tend to find is that these social roles can sometimes take over who we are, and they can dominate us in a way where our personality starts to disappear. And we're looking at the kind of penultimate study that examined how impactful social roles can be on us when we find ourselves as a part of a group. What we have to go to is a couple decades ago down in Stanford, when a very famous and also controversial figure in psychology named Philip Zimbardo ran his very uncomfortable Philip Zimbardo, we'd say a prison study. It's got lots of different names. It's sometimes called the quiet rage study, and sometimes called the conformity study, even though that's already a name that can be tied to the Ash Line study that we talked about earlier. I don't want to necessarily spend too much time worrying about the names and some of the issues around whether or not Zimbardo's research was ethical or even really well thought out. What I do want you to do is make sure that you do the readings on this study that are talked about in the text. And then afterwards, I'd love for you to watch the video entitled Quiet Rage, which was, I think, the second video made on the study. There's been, I think, a third and a fourth since then. But the second one is kind of a perfect package that details the event and also gets across the message of what happens when we, again, do get into the group and start to lose ourself and focus more just on the social roles that we've been assigned. So I guess I'm going to bid you adieu here, but don't forget there's still a second class, and I want to make sure that you're watching that and that you're really getting the most from that really kind of jarring video called Quiet Rage. So take care all, and I guess I'll see many of you soon when we get into our next module. Bye.